teeth ground sharp, and eyes glowing red.
I don't believe in ghosts, but I witnessed something during second grade that resembled one. Before moving to my current home, my family lived in a small apartment. The real estate agent mentioned the place was prone to burglaries, prompting my parents to change the locks immediately. Consequently, we avoided any break-ins during our 3-year stay. One night, after taking a bath, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror to brush my teeth. The bathroom setup was such that a mirror reflected the frosted glass door of the bathroom opposite it. While brushing my teeth, I diligently watched the hourglass, as my parents had instructed me to brush for 3 minutes. For a brief moment, less than a second, I glimpsed a human hand appear and disappear at the top of the frosted glass. Being in second grade, it didn't strike much fear in me, and I continued brushing until the sand depleted. Then I went to sleep. I never saw the hand again, and 6 months later, we moved to our current house. Although I was young, the incident lingered in my mind, leading me to ask my parents about it. Initially, they took my story lightly, but their expressions turned serious when I mentioned the hand. It turned out my parents had numerous eerie experiences in our previous apartment. They spoke of the bathroom door locking, trapping them during baths, and feeling their hair being tugged from above. Over a decade has passed since we moved, but reflecting on our brief time in that apartment, I suspect my parents unknowingly encountered spirits. It left me wondering if the real estate agent knew about these happenings, perhaps using the burglary tale as a cover.
It all happened about 13 years ago. I was about 14 years old, and I will always remember that late evening. A bit of context first. We are 8 siblings, 4 girls, 4 boys, raised only by Mom. Dad walked out on us a few years prior to the event I am about to tell. We grew up quite modest. Mom was the only breadwinner. We didn't have a lot, and we were living in a rental that was just a bathroom, a small hallway, a living room that doubled as a bedroom for the girls and Mom, and a kitchen that also doubled as a bedroom for the boys. Anyway, we were a content Christian family. It was the 31st of October, and we were only 7 at home. My oldest sister was out and Mom was at work. Me being the second one, I was in charge. It was about 7 p.m. and we were all in the living room minding our business. Some of us were playing with some toys, I was painting, a few were watching TV, and it was quite peaceful, just waiting for Mom to come home. Suddenly, my younger brother said, "Hey guys, do you hear that?" We turned the TV volume down and listened. From across the hallway that were connecting the 2 main rooms, we could all clearly hear a repetitive, high-pitched banging. It was just as like someone was repeatedly hitting a spoon on a cup. We all stood frozen. It went on for a few minutes and then we stopped. All bundled up together, we slowly crept our way to the kitchen. On the table, there were some stuff like bread, butter, and a jar with a spoon in it. We just ate and we didn't put stuff away. We got close and tried to mix the jam with the spoon, and surely enough, it was the same sound. At this point, we didn't know what was the deal and we were really creeped out. The sound we heard couldn't have been produced by something like the wind or exterior forces. It was very deliberate, and it went on for a few minutes, so not just a spoon falling off or something like that. We put things away and we went back to the living room. That is when the horror really started. I kid you not, around the whole house there was unexplainable bangings. We could hear footsteps in the hallway, above us from the attic, around us from the walls. We all started crying and got in bed. all bundled up, praying. It all went like this for a few minutes, and suddenly we heard the house door open. It was Mom. She had just come back from work, and it all stopped. Needless to say, we all jumped on her, hugging her and crying. We told her what happened, and she was shocked. We never had an experience like that, and when we get together, we sometimes talk about it. It was one of the most scary things that ever happened to us. We all heard the same things. We didn't see anything, but the sounds were real. We think it might have been something like a demonic attack that wanted to create fear in us in one of the darkest nights of the year. Did any of you ever experience something like this?
When my girlfriend and I moved into our current house, we were thrilled. It's a Victorian terrace house, spacious and with original features, mosaic hallway floor, fireplaces, that sort of thing. Given the reputation of Victorian buildings, we should have been prepared for the possibility of a resident ghost. We weren't, though. In my religious beliefs, ghosts are not actually human souls. Those move on to places beyond the perceivable universe, but rather demonic manifestations. Therefore, I was certain that the apparition was malevolent from the first moment I laid eyes on it. At about 3 a.m., I was awoken by the temperature in the room plummeting. I could see my own breath, and there was frost forming on the window. Although it was winter, this chill was still anomalous. It came suddenly and lasted no more than an hour, and our neighbors did not experience it concurrently, or at least not that they noticed. Then the figure appeared. It seemed to form out of the moonlight, seeping through the frosty window, and quickly became denser, though remained see-through. It walked, or arguably floated, parallel to the bed, and phased through the door to the landing. I say arguably floated because although it moved as in taking steps, its legs were increasingly wispy towards the floor. I turned to my girlfriend to see if she may have seen it too. She was twitching and very quietly muttering in her sleep. I put my ear close to her mouth to try and make out the words, but mostly could not. The words may have included blood, sheep, and circle, but I cannot be sure. It may have been my brain creating a false pattern out of chaotic information. The temperature began to pick up again, and with it, my courage increased. I slipped out of bed to see if there were any signs of the entity out in the landing. When I opened the door, it was standing right there looking at me. I shouted, and the entity flew at me, dissipated, and seemed to pass right through me. A most uncomfortable feeling. My shout had jolted my girlfriend awake, and she saw me fall back onto the floor. I don't remember falling. I may have passed out briefly, and I came back around as my girlfriend was trying to pull me over to the bed. Similar incidents plagued us for several weeks, and it was not long before she was seeing the horrible ghost as well. There were also smells of smoke from the unlit fireplaces, quiet bell sounds from indiscernible directions, and even a possible tearing of some wallpaper, though there is a slim chance that a neighbor's cat may be responsible for that one. Eventually, we were thoroughly fed up from being spooked. We purged the house with water aspirations, candles, and prayers, and hung up religious imagery. Gradually, the activity seemed to decrease. It's been many months now since our last paranormal disturbance. I dare say some people will question the connection between our purging and the end of activity, my conflation of ghosts and demons, or even a supernatural cause of the activity in the first place. But that's my account of our experience. Make of it what you will.
Our house was built in 1999 on farmland, and there doesn't seem to be any reason why we'd have paranormal experiences. No cemetery nearby, no one that died in the house, etc. But soon after my daughter and I moved in, she noticed that there were young energies downstairs. One night as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she felt something snuggle behind her, resting an arm across her shoulder. She thought this one felt like a little girl. Other people felt this energy too and thought it was lonely or sad. There was also an incident in the hallway outside of my daughter's bedroom. She'd gotten up to use the bathroom and felt a hand on her back, pushing her. She thought that this energy was male, maybe 12 years old, mischievous. After my husband and his daughter moved in, we started noticing strange things upstairs as well. One day while I was showering, I turned around to rinse the shampoo out of my hair, and something turned the shower handle all the way to hot. Yet I hadn't touched it or bumped it. A couple of months later, it happened again, but this time I saw the handle itself move without human intervention, and that shouldn't be possible. Of course, no one was there. During this same time period, I was splashed with cold water as I walked out of the main bathroom. I felt it splash across my cheek, shoulder, all over my hand and up my forearm, but no water was on my skin. We were definitely creeped out. My husband put up his cross. We were going through the house. He was saying prayers, even though he doesn't believe in ghosts. After the kids moved out, things quieted down a lot. The quote-unquote haunted area extends about 20 by 10 feet and is on both floors. It includes the kitchen, a bathroom upstairs, and one bedroom, the laundry room, hallway, and bathroom downstairs. Our dog won't go into these areas, not even if you put a piece of steak on the floor. I often hear things fall from the shelves downstairs, but the cat sleeps beside me. Someone or something has strummed my husband's guitar when I was here alone. When my youngest was home from university last summer, the only incident we had was someone saying her name in a loud whisper right behind her as she walked from the bathroom to her bedroom. She left at the end of August, and everything seemed fine until a few months ago. My husband was downstairs and stopped to play with our boy kitty, Jake. He had balled up a piece of tinfoil in his hand and decided to see how high Jake would jump to catch it. He stood just outside the laundry room, bent over slightly, showed Jake what he had in his hand before releasing it and tossing it over. The tinfoil sailed about 3 feet away before it bounced off something invisible and came back in his direction. Confused, he picked it up again and tossed it. It hit something invisible halfway across and dropped like dead weight to the floor. Since this happened, I've tried contacting local paranormal investigators and they replied to my email but haven't followed up since. I'm updating this to include an incident that happened yesterday morning. My mom moved in with us a few years ago and has Alzheimer's. For the last while, she's been bedridden and requires extra care. So every morning, 2 healthcare aides arrive to bathe her, change her clothes, etc. They follow a simple routine that includes small tubs of soapy water. These are set on a side table so that they can bathe her in her bed. After getting everything ready, they place the little tubs on the table near the head of the bed and move down to the foot to straighten out the blankets and get the towels ready. Both healthcare aides were startled when the table suddenly started to move on one side. One described it as though someone had leaned against it or pushed it down, causing both tubs to slide off the table, hitting the carpet, cracking the plastic, and spilling soapy water all over the floor. When I returned to the house, one of the girls asked me if I'd had any ghosts lately, because those tubs weren't big enough or heavy enough to make the table lean like that. They claimed that they weren't too close to the edge, as both of them saw them slide across before going over. I can't imagine the wind doing that. And the cat was sleeping in my bedroom with the door closed. There's always something going on that's hard to explain.
My buddy Alex and I were chilling at his place on Halloween night. Definitely too old for trick-or-treating. We were just sitting on his couch, passing a joint back and forth, watching some old slasher movie on TV. His parents were out at some party, and it was just us in this big, creaky house. You know, one of those places where every little noise sounds 10 times louder when you're high. About halfway through the movie, I heard this thump upstairs. I wasn't sure if it was the weed messing with me or what, but it was clear as day. I looked at Alex and he just shrugged. "It's probably just the house settling," he said, taking another hit. I tried to brush it off, but a few minutes later, there was another noise. This time, like slow footsteps. I sat up. "Dude, do you hear that?" Alex paused, exhaling smoke, and listened. There it was again, louder now. The footsteps were unmistakable, moving across the ceiling above us, like someone was pacing in the upstairs hallway. "Bro, no way," Alex said, lowering the joint. "There's no one home." We both stood up, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped for a second, and then we heard a loud knock. It wasn't a normal knock. It sounded like someone was pounding on the wall, right above us. "I'm not imagining this, right?" I whispered, trying to keep my cool. "Nah, man, I gotta check this out," Alex said, grabbing his phone for a flashlight. We tiptoed towards the stairs, hearts racing, every little creak in the floorboards under our feet making me jump. As we climbed the stairs, it got eerily quiet, like whatever had been making the noise was waiting for us. We reached the top, and Alex shone his light down the hallway. It was empty, of course, but something felt off. The air was thick, like you could almost feel eyes on you. "Let's check your room first," I suggested, my voice lower than I intended. His room was right at the end of the hallway, the one directly above where we had been sitting. We walked slowly, the hallway stretching out way longer than it felt before. Just as we reached his door, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was just empty air. My skin prickled, and I swore I could still feel the presence right behind me. "Did you feel that?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. Alex looked freaked out too. "Yeah, like someone's breathing down my neck." Before I could respond, there was a bang. A loud crash right behind us, like something had smashed into the wall. We both jumped, whipping around to face it, but again, nothing, just that same feeling, like someone or something was right behind us, watching. "Let's get out of here, man," Alex said, his voice breaking, but I couldn't move. It felt like if we turned our backs, whatever was there would get us. I was sure of it. Suddenly, we heard the knocking again. 3 slow, heavy bangs from inside Alex's room this time. We stood, frozen, staring at the door. Alex grabbed the handle, hesitated for a second, and then threw it open. The room was empty. Everything looked normal, until we heard footsteps again, this time coming toward us from the hallway. This time, I slammed the door shut, backing away from it. The knocking started again, but this time it was all around us. Behind the walls, above the ceiling, right behind our backs. We were done. We sprinted down the stairs and out the front door without looking back.
So when I was a child growing up, I lived in a haunted house, and I shared the house with my mum, my dad, and my sister. First of all, I'll explain the layout of the house. Now, this house is an old brick house, and it was built in the 1920s. The layout of the house felt really off to me. Even as a 7-year-old, there was just certain things about some of the rooms, especially towards the back of the house, that just felt like they were added on later on. Like they didn't make sense. They felt like the shape and the layout was wrong. Like, a lot of those rooms had no windows, and the doors just felt like they were in the wrong place, if that makes sense. I don't know. These particular rooms, they were actually above a wine cellar, which was under the house. So in Australia, basements are not a thing in houses, but this house also had a wine cellar. And these rooms that made me feel uncomfortable were rooms that sat above where the wine cellar was. Now for the first experience. Okay, so my sister and I, we shared a room growing up, and late one night I remember waking up for no real reason other than the fact that I just felt like I needed to wake up, and I started to feel uncomfortable. Now my sister and I, we were both scared of the dark. We would always have the hall light on, and my bed was facing the doorway, which looked straight out to the hallway, so I always saw the light. And when the light was on, I felt safe. Now, I woke up and everything was dark, so my parents had gone to bed. They'd turned off the hall light. As I've looked down the foot of my bed to the doorway, I could see the figure of what looks like a woman. So this was a very feminine shape, and I just assumed it was Mum, because I'd never experienced ghosts or anything like that in my entire life, so I didn't know what else to think it was. So I'm looking at this thing, and it's looking at me, and it's not saying anything. So I just thought, okay, well, Mum's just checking on us as she got up during the night. So then I've decided to call out to her, and I say, Mum, because I wanted to know what she was doing there, and there was no answer. So I just thought maybe she didn't hear me. So again, I say, Mum. And I said it louder, and again, it didn't say anything. At this point, I was actually really scared because I started to feel like, okay, this isn't Mum. I remember whispering over to my sister, asking her if she was awake, and she's whispered back, yes. So then I asked her, is that Mum? And she whispers back that she doesn't know. She didn't know who it was, and we both started to feel really scared. Then I remember yelling out as loud as I could for Mum, and so Mum's come running into the bedroom. The figure's still there meanwhile, and as she's ran into the bedroom door, she's ran straight through this figure of this apparition, and then all of a sudden it was gone. And so the second experience, this one is by far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. And honestly, to this day, I still have nightmares about it at least, I'd say probably a couple of times a month, maybe 3 or 4 times a month actually. So this particular one, this took place in the daytime, and it was in the wine cellar, which is situated underneath the house. And it was also underneath those rooms that just would really creep me out for a reason I couldn't figure out. I didn't understand it. Okay, now this cellar had 2 rooms. One was a really big room, and then further back was a smaller section of the room. So this particular day, my sister and I were in the first section of the wine cellar, and our dog starts to growl and bark. And after this happened, I remember feeling the urge to sort of just look up towards the back section of the cellar, which was a lot darker. Now, as I've looked up, I remember seeing a tall, big, dark figure, and it was definitely male. I remember the shape, I remember the outline of the shoulders, and it almost looked like it was wearing like overalls, like the long sort of coveralls that you would wear if you were a miner. Now, I just want to mention that the town that we lived in at the time was a very old mining town as well, which had a few mine disasters back in the early 1900s. So as I've looked up at this shape, this figure, I remember being completely frozen, and I wasn't able to move or speak, and I knew that what it was that I was looking at was completely evil. I felt like it wanted to hurt us, and it was going to do whatever it could to harm us. This feeling in the cellar, it was oppressive, it was heavy, and I remember my body feeling stuck, like I couldn't move. I was completely frozen, and I felt in my body, I felt heavy. There was a heaviness in my chest, in my legs, just the atmosphere felt completely different, like nothing I'd ever felt. Then this figure, he showed his face to us. I will never forget what I saw next. It gave us a grin that is burned into my brain. It was the most scariest, evil grimace that I have ever seen. And as it's looking at us with this grin across its face, as it was taking steps backwards into the cellar, it's gesturing with its hand with this grimace across its face. and putting, tilting its head backwards, like beckoning. I could feel in my mind that it was definitely wanting us to follow it into the darkness, but I knew that that was not going to be the best thing for me to do. I knew I shouldn't follow it. I didn't want to follow it, and I also couldn't move, and I was just so scared. Watching its face, watching its head as it's waving for us to follow him into the darkness. I knew that if we had, then it was extremely bad. Whatever it was that was going to happen, I knew that it would not be good. And so I stood there, frozen. I'm not sure, it felt like a really long time, but thankfully, my sister, she's a lot braver than me. She's grabbed me by the arm and screamed at me to run, and we had to get out of there. After talking to my dad about that a few years ago, he actually mentioned to me, he'd forgotten about that. We'd had this experience, and so my dad had told me that he'd also experienced a few things in the house, and that was actually the reason why we left, because he'd been experiencing things as well.
I met the love of my life at 23. I was a single parent, and I quickly fell in love with this woman who was able to fill a void in our lives. It was a whirlwind relationship, and we married sooner than I would care to admit. She was in the military, and we had 200 kilometers distance between us. All I wanted was to be together, so we quickly bought a house. We were finally able to just be together every day instead of just on the weekends. The house was 30 years old, and the decor was extremely outdated. But it was our home. The first thing on my mind was remodeling. We were young, with a 3-year-old, and I hadn't been able to find a job, so money was very tight. We had to start the remodeling ourselves. Google and YouTube became my new best friends. Ridding the living room of the wood paneling was priority number 1. One weekend, we took on the daunting task of removing the paneling. Behind one of the walls, we found a secret room. It was dark, very dusty, with cobwebs everywhere, but there was a cute little table and tea set, which seemed perfect for my daughter. I was so excited to find this neat little playroom. My daughter was also thrilled. We decided to continue removing the paneling in the rest of the living room, and I promised my daughter that I would clean up her new playroom in the morning. That night, I was restless. I had strange dreams of evil. That is the only way I know how to describe it. I awoke with the feeling of impending doom. I got up for a glass of water, and I noticed something strange in the secret room as I passed by there. Sitting at the table were a pair of twin girls. They appeared to be 8 years old. They both had their hair in pigtail braids with blue ribbons tied at the end of each braid. They even wore these matching dresses. They were pale, so very pale. Their eyes were empty, indescribable. They just sat there, staring. Somehow, I knew that they meant harm. I quickly woke up my partner and told her that we need to leave now. Initially, she tried to dismiss me, but decided to check out the secret room anyway. She saw the same thing I did and ran for my daughter. We left that very moment, taking nothing with us except for the clothes on our backs. I had this feeling that if we took anything with us, they would follow somehow. We never went back. We foreclosed on that house, and I don't know what happened to it after that. It has been 7 years since the incident, and still, we do not talk about it. I live in constant fear that those things will find us. I have a feeling that my wife has the same fear, but she'll never admit it. I sage my house weekly, and I burn incense in hopes of keeping evil away. Luckily, my daughter does not remember the incident and has been able to have a carefree childhood. She thinks the sage and incense are just to make the house smell good. Maybe sharing my story here will help me be a little more at ease.
So, my reno or renovation is haunted, and has been for around 10 years or so, I'd say, ever since the time I moved in, so at least as long as I've been there. I'm not sure if he was there before or for how long, because it was before my time. My partner and I decided to escape the dreadful rental market in Sydney, so we began the search for a house, one that had 3 bedrooms, wasn't about to collapse on us, and within our price range. After getting a loan from the bank and some help from our parents, we were able to take the next step. We spent a lot of time searching and finally found one. We knew we'd have to clean it up, and there were still some odds and ends, but the idea of not having to deal with a shitty landlord, my partner joked that someone must have died in the house because one of the rooms had old gross carpet pulled up, exposing the wooden floor, and the walls had been quickly painted over. Needless to say, this room definitely stood out amongst the other rooms. If someone did pass away, our real estate agent didn't tell us. I don't think they have to, unless there was a murder, or if it happened in the last 5 years. I'll skip the boring parts. We moved all of our things inside, and worked on clearing out their old stuff. There were some good things, some furniture, but just a lot of junk we needed to throw away. Now, unless someone was in a room and wanted privacy, we tend to keep the doors open, so our cats have full roam of the place. I was walking down the hallway, calling out my partner's name, and I went past the bedroom. I saw a man standing there, looking at the doorway, and when I went to check, no one was there. I thought it was weird, but since it was a new house and I was still getting used to it, my husband was outside bringing in more boxes, and I figured it must have been a shadow or something. Our 2 cats live like royalty and had free rein to go wherever, but even if we were both in that room, they'd hesitate to go in there too. They'd hiss from the door and would scream murder if we brought them inside with us. We even tried giving them treats inside the room, but they still didn't want to come in. The renovations kept going with the place, getting some new carpet and a lick of paint to make it look better. The bathrooms needed to be gutted and completely redone. Same with the old, tired-looking kitchen. The ghost didn't seem to care too much when work was being done on other areas of the house, but it was only when things were changed or we were in that room. I went in to take out the old-school plastic blinds, and the house took on an uneasy feel to it. Once it was off, I put it to one side and started painting with some samples of different colors. There were about 4 or 5 on the wall, and I was standing with a paintbrush in hand, comparing the different shades. Wanting to send a picture to one of my friends, I walked to grab my phone, and came back to what looked like someone's hand had rubbed the paint all together. It looked like an absolute filthy mess, and it would need work to fix it. I knew for a fact I hadn't done it, and my husband wasn't home. I stared at it for a while, pissed off, and took some photos to show people what happened. Some of my friends said that was really weird, and asked if someone had broken in, because the area we were in wasn't great. If someone did, then why didn't they steal anything? And there were no signs of a forced entry either. I showed my husband when he got home from work. He was just as confused as I was. Still, we invested our future and our parents' money into this house, so selling was out of the question. We painted the room anyway, and it felt like someone was standing over me while we were painting. That night, in bed, I told my husband about the feeling I had, and it turns out he felt the same way. Suddenly, we heard the door slam hard. We both jumped violently out of bed, and while my husband checked the house for any signs of an intruder, my gut feeling was that it was the ghost. Over the next week, we'd be woken up during the night, and finally, I decided to try something. Perhaps it was because of all the sleepless nights, or maybe it was just an impulsive decision. I went inside the room, and it was freezing, even during the middle of the Aussie summer. "Look, I know you're not happy about us being here," I said. "We don't want to bother you, so here is the deal. We won't come into this room anymore and just use it for storage." I don't know why I went with this one, but we decided to call the ghost Billy, rather than William, which gives me the creeps, or D, but with an ick at the end. I think you know what I'm trying to say. There was no dramatic answer, no banging sounds or signs of agitation. I wasn't sure if it worked or not, until I realized that we could paint in there without interruptions. The sharp chill was gone, which, by the way, was really annoying in the summer, because it got so hot in there. The oppressive feeling was gone. We got the room done and kept our word. We stored boxes and random pieces in there. We'd see him occasionally when we passed by the room, but he wasn't a nuisance anymore. A good 7 or 8 years passed without any issues. I would love to say it had a happy ending and ended there, but we had friends who were staying over from the US, and we needed a place to put them. Neither of us thought too much about it. We put a mattress down in the room, and our friends stayed in there for the night. We were woken up by furniture shaking during the middle of the night. Our friend opened the door and came into us, and it was then we remembered our house ghost, Billy. They stayed in the lounge room for the rest of the trip. When they left, the ghost started slamming doors. There was loud stomping footsteps down the hallway, and we had to go in to apologize. The noise stopped. So yeah, I guess we won't be using that room as a kid's bedroom.
For as long as I've known my wife, she's mentioned growing up in a haunted house. I always assumed that she was joking because she always brought it up in quite a lighthearted way and never went into much detail. It was a big old house, and I figured that she was talking about weird old house noises. The house belonged to her great aunt, who raised my wife for most of her childhood. Her great aunt recently passed away, and her great aunt's daughter, whom my wife calls her aunt, though technically she's her second cousin or something, I'll be referring to her as her aunt, now owns the house. After my wife's great aunt passed, we went to stay in the house for 4 nights to attend the funeral and spend some time with my wife's family, as we live in another state. When we got there, my wife and her aunt were chatting and mentioned that they thought my wife's great aunt might join the ghosts already haunting the house. I still didn't consider that they might actually be serious. The first night we spent there, I woke up in the middle of the night and noticed someone standing in the corner of the room beside the door. Thinking it was my wife, I asked what she was doing. This woke up my wife, who was actually sleeping beside me. I said I thought I saw someone in the room with us, but it must just be my eyes playing tricks on me. She said, "The person in the corner next to the door? Yeah, don't worry about it." It almost made me angry. I thought that there was some creep in the room and my wife was too sleepy to process what was happening. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but when my phone lit up the room, I saw that there was no one there. There wasn't even a weird shape that I might have mistaken for a person. The door was closed, so it wasn't like there could have been someone there who left the room in the moments that I was looking away to grab my phone. My wife told me it was common to see shadowy people in the night, but I shouldn't worry because they don't do anything. She fell back asleep right after that, but I just lay there awake the whole night, wondering what had just happened. The next morning I asked my wife about it, and she said she wasn't kidding about the house being haunted. People who spend the night in the house regularly see and hear ghosts, but they never hurt anyone or caused any problems. I remained skeptical even after the next night, which had been after the funeral, and my wife and aunt both reported that they'd been visited in their dreams by my wife's great aunt. And so far in my mind, everything was weird but explainable. The figure in the room could have been a strange trick of the light. My wife and her aunt had just attended the funeral of their loved one, and it made sense for them both to dream about her that night. The third night, I was kept awake for hours by the constant sound of footsteps pacing around the house. My wife also heard them, but said it was normal and I shouldn't worry, and she fell asleep easily. A few times during the night I got up to look around for the source of the noise. I even did a couple of laps of the outside of the house in case there was someone outside, and I never saw anyone walking around. At one point I was in the lounge room and heard footsteps from the kitchen, and called out to ask if there was anyone there. My wife's aunt opened her bedroom door and said that she could hear the footsteps too, and just like my wife, she told me it was normal and there was no cause for concern. Then, there was the sound of a drawer opening in the kitchen, which we both reacted to, and I went to check and found the cutlery drawer open. My wife's aunt, who'd come to the kitchen too, simply closed the drawer, commented with mild annoyance that the ghosts are always leaving things open, and went back to bed, leaving me to my existential crisis. I could not come up with a way to explain that away. We both heard the footsteps, both heard the drawer open at the same time, and there was no one there, and no way out of the kitchen except for past us. I tried staying on the couch to try and catch the mystery walker, and there was multiple times I heard the footsteps pass through the lounge room, but I never saw anything. Eventually I gave up and went back to bed. Nothing really happened the final night, though we woke up to several cabinets open and no one remembered leaving them open, though that could be explainable by someone just forgetting or even sleepwalking. Even so, the footsteps still bothered me, and the shadowy person from the first night and cabinets opened on the final night made me nervous in light of everything that happened on the third night. Up until now, I've always scoffed at the idea of the paranormal, but I just can't reconcile my experiences in that house with my skepticism. Talking to my wife's family revealed that everyone who stayed in the house believes it's haunted because they've had at least one completely unexplainable experience there. They all report that the ghosts leave people alone for the most part, though some who lived there for a long time as children, including my wife and her aunt, have described meeting people they thought were probably ghosts and having positive but strange interactions with them.
This happened more than 10 years ago, during the Aubonne holidays when my family would visit my paternal grandfather's 100-year-old house in the countryside. The house felt like post-war Japan, gloomy and cool, even in summer. My elementary school summer project was to research old things, and my grandfather's house was perfect for this task. My grandfather mentioned there were more items in the attic, so out of curiosity, my brother and I decided to explore. The attic was dusty, with creaking floorboards, and it felt like an adventure. Until I spotted a black, human-shaped silhouette floating against the wall. My brother was behind me, so it couldn't be him. It was a shadow, but not one that could be explained by light or scientific phenomena. Fear overwhelmed me, and I clung to my brother. "There's something over there," I whispered. My brother, his flashlight illuminating the shadow, confirmed. "You're right. Something like a shadow is there." We cautiously retreated to the ladder and scrambled down. Grandma heard the commotion and urged us to clean up. Later, I recounted the incident to my family. My parents suggested that old houses might have ghosts, but my grandparents took it seriously, speculating that it could be an ancestor visiting during Aubonne. Though we never experienced misfortune afterward, I couldn't shake the mystery of the shadow. Was it my ancestor? An evil spirit? Or just a fleeting ghost? To this day, there's no way to know for certain.
When I was a kid, we had a lovely backyard with a full garden that we hadn't built. It was all built by the previous homeowner, who had actually passed away in the house. My parents kept it all intact, but they never really did anything extra with it. They left what the previous owner had planted and just let it do what it naturally did. It was actually quite pretty, and even being left to its own devices, it would be the loveliest little flower bed. To add to this, the previous owner had installed a clothesline around the flower bed, and my mom was old-fashioned, so she believed that sun-dried clothes smelled fresher and felt crisper. One day, she asked me to go hang the laundry outside. Normally this was a chore, but I didn't really mind. I enjoyed it. But on this day, for some reason, when I stepped outside with a basket of damp clothing, I stopped. I don't mean that I just stopped walking. I mean that I literally froze, unable to move on my own. I got hit with this intense fear, this strange and paralyzing feeling of unease. It was overwhelming, so overwhelming that I almost started to feel like I was going to cry. I tried to keep going, tried to take a step forward, but I literally couldn't. I was trying to think logically, looking around for a person in the yard watching me, thinking about whether or not I'd watch a scary movie or read something that had me in an anxiety attack. Look, I was 12, so I was just trying to piece together why I was feeling like I was freaking out in the backyard that I had spent countless hours in. At some point, my mother must have realized that I was acting strangely and just standing there in the yard and staring at nothing in particular when she had asked me to take care of the laundry. I heard the back door open and her stepping toward me. Then I heard her say, "Hey, Melody, what's wrong? What are you?" Then she just stopped when she got next to me. I glanced over at her, and I watched as the color drained from her face and her eyes got wide. She felt it too. I remember just looking back at the garden, looking for whatever it was that was causing this and asking, "What is going on, Mom?" To which she said, I don't know. Let's go back inside." She then grabbed my arm and pulled me back to the house. We got back inside and she just stood there staring at the flower bed looking terrified. I asked her if there was something out there, and she just shook her head, saying that she didn't know. I asked her if she felt what I felt, and she told me that she felt something but didn't know or understood what it was. She ended up just throwing the clothes in the dryer, and we didn't talk about it after that. She didn't even mention it to my dad. So, what the hell was that? We never spoke about it at all after that day, but I've obviously never forgotten it. My mom didn't hang the clothing on the line for a couple months after this, and I think that whatever that feeling was the reason. I know that there was nothing physical there. It wasn't like a creep in the yard or some animal or something. It was just our normal backyard, complete with pretty flowers in the back. So, why were we so freaked out then? In the end, I'm chalking this up to something paranormal because it was not normal. I don't know if it was some spirit in the garden or some weird messed up shared hallucination, but it was horrifying and definitely something beyond our understanding.
I grew up in the 90s in Minnesota. My parents divorced when I was 8, and we spent every other weekend at my dad's haunted house in East Bethel. The house had every type of ghost you could think of. A shadow man in a trench coat and brimmed hat, another separate shadow figure that danced down the hallway, a man dressed to go fishing, a doppelganger of my father, 2 giggling little girl ghosts, and many other unseen entities. The dishwasher, radios and lights would turn themselves on and off randomly. Loud banging would be heard on the walls and the doors. Door handles would jiggle and turn on their own. Feelings of being touched and caressed in the shower were reported. My father had an incident where he felt someone crawl into bed with him in the middle of the night when he was the only one home. My uncle reported hearing 2 little girls giggling and singing in the basement one night while sleeping downstairs. Upon awakening the next morning, he discovered there were no kids in the house that night. One sunny Saturday morning while visiting my dad, my brother and I were up early watching cartoons. I was 8 years old, my brother was 3. As we sat on the couch, we heard 3 knocking sounds on the wall, 5 or 6 feet behind us. Our heads quickly snapped back to look at the wall where the sound was coming from, but we saw nothing. My brother and I quickly turned to look at each other with frightened eyes. I, being the older sister, tried to be brave. I told him it was nothing. As we turned our attention back to the cartoons, my little 8-year-old brain is spinning. What if that banging noise we just heard wasn't just the pipes, as I had been told so many times? What if it was a ghost? I hate when ghosts come around. Why isn't my dad around whenever this happens? As these thoughts swirl in my head, we hear it again. This time it's coming from somewhere in the kitchen off to our left. It's not as loud as the first time, and the sound is different, like someone is knocking on the kitchen counter this time, instead of the wall. We quickly strain our necks and peek inside the kitchen with lightning speed to catch whomever or whatever is making that noise. Again, there is nothing there. I take a deep breath. Once again, I pretend to be brave and tell my brother, "It's nothing, just ignore it." My heart is thumping in my chest, and there are butterflies in my tummy as the familiar anxiety grows worse with each passing second. I tuck myself up on the couch in a ball, not wanting my legs to dangle off the edge. I no longer feel safe. Nothing is to be trusted. This time the sound is coming from the dining room. I can tell the noise is coming from the wooden dining table this time. I can see the entire table from where I'm sitting with ease, and there is nothing on the table that could be making that noise. No one except me and my brother are awake. There is no one in the dining room. There is no logical reason for this knocking noise that seems to be moving around us. Just then, I realize the knocking sound has been moving in a big circle around us. If this invisible entity is to move any closer to us, the next logical place for it to be would be in the living room where me and my brother are currently sitting. No sooner than that thought crossed my mind, it happened again. This time the noise was coming from the coffee table sitting less than 1 foot away from us. I instantly flipped over the back of my couch in a reverse somersault-like motion and ran at superhuman speed to my father's bedroom. In my panic, I completely left my little 3-year-old brother behind to fend for himself. Luckily, he wasn't too far behind. We sneak into our father's room and quietly lay on the floor. Our dad would have been super pissed if we woke him up early on a Saturday morning, even for a ghost. In our commotion, we wake up our 6-year-old sister, who's sleeping on our dad's floor. Us 3 kids always slept on his floor together when we were visiting. So we quietly whisper what just happened out in the living room to our sister. As we're telling her this story, something catches our eye. We can see a black shadow under the small space between the bottom of the door and the plush carpet. This black shadow is slowly pacing back and forth in the hallway, just on the other side of the bedroom door. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, like this shadow is waiting for us. Unfortunately, I don't remember what happened after this point. Somehow, the rest of that memory has been lost with time. but I know for sure we didn't open that door. As an adult, I often wish I would have been brave and opened the door. What would have been waiting? Would the entity have entered the room and attacked? Would we have been shocked and confused to find the hallway empty? Would the grey shadow just keep pacing the hallway, oblivious to our frightened, curious eyes? I've done a lot of research on the property over the years, and can't find any evidence of a death or a tragedy that would account for so much paranormal activity. I also reached out to previous and current owners to see if they had any strange experiences. The two families who lived there previously said they never had any strange experiences. Neither did the family who lived there right after my family. The family currently living there did not respond to my questions, and in hindsight, I regret even asking them. It wasn't cool of me to even put that thought in their head. Prior to the home being built, all I can find is that the land the house sits on was part of a farm for a family that I could find little information on. So, was my family haunted? Or were we all suffering from mass hysteria for 12 plus years?
My grandmother used to tell me stories when I was a child, especially on nights when the wind howled through the trees outside, or when a storm would roll in, making our lights flicker. It was her way of entertaining me, I suppose. Or maybe she just liked seeing me squirm. But there was one story, one that stuck with me all of my life, long after she'd passed, and her voice was just a memory. It was my favorite when I was younger, but as I got older, I understood it was more than just a bedtime tale. It was something darker, something seriously weird. This story had lingered in our family for decades. She would sit me down in that quiet, almost whispery tone that she would save for moments like this, and she'd always start with, "I was just a girl during the war." Now, I think when I was a kid, I believed this was a story that she'd gotten from some book. That's how wild it was and out there it was. I thought she was just pretending that it happened to her, then added a little extra edge to the narrative. It was only after I became an adult and began reading for myself, learning for myself, and talking to people on my own, that I would share this story. And nobody had ever heard anything like it. It turned out it really did belong to her, and it wasn't something she heard by the fire or read in a library. She was a kid when World War II was going on, when the factories were humming. The air was thick with that kind of uncertainty that only war can bring. She lived in a suburb, the kind where everybody knew each other's business, where news traveled very fast, and tragedy even faster. That was the world that she grew up in. Flags on every single corner, and folks constantly getting word their sons or brothers had been gunned down overseas. When she wasn't at school, she worked as a babysitter for a family down the street. Deborah was the mother, a hardworking woman who'd found herself at a local factory, making parts for the war effort. Her husband, Stephen, had been drafted, and while he was off somewhere in Europe fighting, Deborah was left to raise their young daughter, Marin, all alone. Marin was 5, maybe 6 at the time. A sweet little girl, my grandmother said. Always polite, always with a smile that could light up a room. It was the kind of innocence that reminded everybody of a simpler time, before the war, before everything had turned so grim. Margaret, my mother, grew close to Marin over time. She was practically family at some point, spending most mornings and afternoons with the girl, while Deborah worked her long shifts at the factory. They played games, read stories, and for the most part, life was uneventful, quiet in a way that everybody secretly feared would end at any moment. Just a bomb away. Things didn't change with the bomb, though. It was even worse. My grandma told me that the first sign something was wrong happened on a bitter cold day in late November. She'd gone over to babysit per usual, but the moment she walked through the door, Marin was different. She threw a tantrum about the most trivial things, her dress being too tight, the light in the kitchen being too bright. She lashed out at my grandmother, screaming, crying, even hurling insults, which was completely out of character for that little girl. My grandmother, who was now baffled and a bit frightened by the outburst, tried to calm her down, but nothing seemed to work. Marin went on about the lights, even the sun from the outside. Everything was too bright. One look at her eyes and you knew she wasn't lying. They were dilated beyond disbelief, almost totally black. My grandmother tried to make it as dark as possible, but nothing seemed to please the child. And then when Deborah came home later that day, her face was ashen, eyes hollow, as if she aged years in just a few hours. That was when my grandmother learned the news. Deborah had received a call that afternoon, a devastating one. Her brother, who'd been fighting in France, had been killed in action. My employer was the last one to receive that tragic news from the war front. Marin didn't know. Nobody had told her. She was far too young, too fragile for such a conversation. Yet, her behavior had changed the exact moment Deborah had gotten that call. My grandma said they found it very strange, uncanny even, but life was filled with coincidences, was it not? They pushed it aside, and my grandmother offered her condolences, quietly leaving the house to give Deborah her space. But deep down, she said, something was gnawing at her, a feeling that there was more going on than anybody could actually see. In the days that followed, Marin's behavior only got worse. It wasn't just the tantrums anymore. She'd fly into fits of rage, screaming at the top of her lungs, pounding her fists into the floor until her knuckles were raw. She began talking about things, dark, horrific things. She began mentioning places that she would have no way of talking about, knowing about, described bombed out villages and soldiers dying in the fields. Her voice would drop to a growl when she spoke, her eyes rolling back as if she was channeling something not of this world. The worst part, my grandmother said, was that her words lined up perfectly with what they later learned in the news. Each time the casualty numbers rose and rose. Each time a new battle was reported, Marin's strange fits would grow more and more intense. The townspeople began to talk. Whispers of possession floated around like the wind of ash. Children sang nursery rhymes about her, making the rumors worse. Deborah was beside herself. She started keeping Marin inside, locking all her doors, drawing the curtains, trying to shield herself from the world as best she could. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. My grandma would still come over when Deborah needed a break, though these visits were fewer and far between. She told me about one afternoon when she was in the kitchen washing dishes, while Deborah took a nap on the couch, utterly exhausted. Marin had been quietly playing in a room, or so my grandma thought. That's when she heard a noise, a low, haunting tone floating through the house. She followed the sound to the living room, where she found Marin sitting at the family piano. Marin's tiny hands danced across the keys, playing a piece my grandma had never even heard before. Something complex, something classical, far beyond the abilities of a child who had never touched an instrument in her life. As she continued to play, she began to sing in a voice that was not her own. It was deeper, older. The song itself was in a language my grandmother didn't even understand at first. Then she realized it was Italian. An opera maybe, but the words were unfamiliar, foreign, and the melody itself sent a chill down her spine. Worse still, Marin did not blink the entire time she played. Her eyes locked on my grandmother with this intensity that made her stomach turn. She had this weird smile dancing at the edges of her lips. It was as if she knew what she was doing was unnatural. Deborah woke up halfway through and ran into the room, screaming at Marin to stop, to snap out of it. But the girl just continued to smile, her fingers gliding over the keys, her voice echoing off the walls. In fact, when Deborah asked her to stop, Marin sang even louder. My grandmother thought that the walls would surely crack. They managed to pull her away from the piano, but the damage was done. My grandma said the air in the house felt different after that, heavy with something that did not belong. The stories continued to spread. Neighbors claimed Marin could predict the future. She knew things no child should. Deborah stopped sending her outside altogether, kept her locked inside of her room almost like a prisoner. My grandma, now terrified but still feeling a sense of duty, continued to visit, though each time she left the house, she swore she could feel eyes on her, following her, watching her every move. And then came the night that everything changed. My mother said she'd gone over to check on Deborah, who was barely holding it together. Maren had been locked up in her room all day. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. As my grandmother cleaned up the kitchen, she heard a door creak upstairs. At first, she thought really nothing of it. Maybe Deborah had gone upstairs to check on Maren. But when she glanced up the stairs, she saw something. Maren was atop the staircase, holding something in her hand. It glinted in the dim light. A razor blade. My grandmother screamed for Deborah, but before she could move, Maren slowly began walking down the stairs, her feet leaving small, dark smears of blood with every single step. She wasn't crying, she wasn't wincing in pain. She was completely expressionless, as though what she'd done didn't even matter in the slightest. My grandmother froze as Maren reached the bottom of the stairs, holding up her feet. They were flayed, the skin and muscles sliced clean off, hanging off in ribbons. Deborah came running, her screams mingling with my grandmother's. But Maren just stood there, watching them, eyes cold and empty. Then, without warning, she began to sing again. That same Italian opera, the haunting tune filling up the room and making the walls almost seem to close in around them. Deborah scooped her up and rushed her to the hospital, leaving my grandmother just standing there, covered in blood. The sound of Maren's voice still echoing in my ears. My grandma went to do the only thing that she could think of: clean the blood from the stairs in the bathroom. It was everywhere, enough to fill a child, she said. When she got to the bathroom itself, she found Maren's skin and muscle arranged in this mosaic piece of art on the tile floor. Rumors said that Maren had sung that opera for 36 uninterrupted hours. And when they unwrapped her feet, those wounds were gone, as if they'd never been there at all. She now only spoke in Latin, refusing to acknowledge anyone unless they addressed her in that ancient tongue. While this was going on, Deborah received another call. Her husband's entire unit had gone missing during the skirmish and were considered MIA inside enemy territory. Again, she never relayed any of this information to Maren, but her behavior became even worse the second the phone rang. Everything with this little girl seemed to be directly affected by the war. When my grandmother was finally allowed to visit again, Maren was now in a coma, her little body motionless inside a hospital bed. Deborah now looked like a ghost, her hair matted, dark circles underneath her eyes, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She told my grandma everything, and the doctors were baffled. The nurses were terrified. They'd brought in priests, plural, to perform prayers, but nothing seemed to work. And it wasn't until Deborah received another phone call, this time telling her that Stephen, Maren's father, had been found alive. And that's when the girl finally stirred. When she awoke, she was back to normal, or at least that's what they wanted to believe. My grandmother never babysat for them again. Every time she saw Maren around town after that, the girl would just smile, a creepy knowing smile that sent shivers down my grandmother's spine. It was like Maren knew something, a secret, a terrible truth that nobody else could comprehend. Grandma Margaret believed there was something still dwelling inside that girl to the very day she died. For years, that family kept mostly to themselves. Stephen returned from the war, and life seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy, at least for them. But those rumors never ceased. People still talked about how Maren had grown quieter, more reserved, her strange abilities persisting. She would still predict things that made no sense for a child to know. My grandmother swore that Maren had a way of knowing when somebody was about to die. She'd make these offhanded comments that seemed like nonsense to people around her. But within days, whatever she mentioned would end up in an accident or worse. One summer afternoon, my grandma ran into Deborah at a local market. It had been a while since they even spoken, and my grandmother noticed right away how much older Deborah looked. Her once vibrant hair had dulled into a lifeless gray. Her face was etched with lines of worry and exhaustion. They exchanged pleasantries, but my grandma couldn't help but ask how Maren was doing. Deborah did not answer right away, Instead, she just stared off into the distance, her eyes glassy, as if she was searching for something just out of reach. "She's fine," Deborah finally said, but her voice was hollow, lacking any real conviction. "She's quiet now, but doesn't leave her room much." There was a long pause before she added, almost underneath her breath, "Sometimes I think she's waiting for something." My grandma did not push the conversation any further. She said goodbye and left, but that encounter stuck with her for years after. The last time my grandmother said she saw Marin was a few years later, but by then the town had started to forget about those strange things. That all happened during the war, and most people were content to move on with their lives. But my grandma, she never forgot. One evening, she was walking home from the bakery, the sky darkening with the approach of a storm. As she passed the old church at the edge of town, she saw Marin sitting on the steps, staring out into the distance, her face pale and eyes wide. My grandmother said it didn't look like she'd aged a day since the incident at the hospital. Her hair was the same color, her skin was still that same soft porcelain white. Her eyes, though, her eyes were different. They almost had this hollowness to them, a depth that no child should have. As my grandmother approached, Marin turned her head and slowly locked eyes with her. "Hi, Margaret," she said. "Do you ever dream?" The questions sent a chill down my grandmother's spine. She stopped immediately in her tracks, pulse quickening. "What do you mean? Do you close your eyes and see things that aren't there?" Before my grandma could even respond, Marin stood up, dusted off her dress, and walked away, disappearing into the darkened streets without another word. My grandmother stood there for what felt like an eternity, with her mind racing, confusion, that old familiar dread lingering again. She said she never saw Marin again after that. Years later, when I was old enough to understand more about the story, my grandma said she looked into what happened to Marin and her family after that day. Apparently, not long after this encounter, Stephen had had a terrible accident at the factory where he'd been working since the war. He was crushed beneath a piece of machinery, killed instantly. On the day that it happened, my grandma said she received a letter from Deborah, a hastily written note with trembling handwriting. In it, Deborah wrote that Marin had been acting strange all morning. She hadn't spoken a word, but sat by the window, staring at the sky and humming that same Italian opera song. When Deborah got the call about Stephen's death, she rushed upstairs to check on Marin, but when she opened up the door, the room was empty. Marin was gone. The window was open, the curtains billowing in the wind, and there was no sign of the girl. They searched the town, the woods, the nearby river, but never found her. It was as if she vanished into thin air. Some people thought she'd run away, while others whispered that something far darker had taken her, but nobody really ever knew. She never spoke about Marin again after that, but it was the weight of the story, the horrors that she witnessed, had become far too much for her to bear. Every now and again, on those stormy nights when the wind howled and the lights flickered, I could see that same look in her eyes, that same fear, that same dread that haunted her for years and years. And even though she never said it aloud, I knew what she was thinking, that somewhere out there, Marin was still waiting, still watching, still smiling that terrible smile, like something else was living inside of her.
For reference, I'm 20 years old, and my younger sister is 16. We grew up in a small town in the western part of Maryland. I now know that the entire town is most likely on a ley line, but I don't count that to be 100% true. What I do know for sure, that the town we grew up in was very, very weird, to say the least. Up until the age of 8, we lived in one house a few streets over from where my parents live now. I don't remember much from this house, other than sometimes seeing a large shadow cross doorways. As a kid, I also had an imaginary friend, Sarah. Sarah was blonde, with green eyes and a white and blue Victorian dress, and couldn't have been older than 11. When we moved into the new house, things started getting progressively worse, other than the fact that our new house was haunted by several spirits and had a demon in the basement. More on that in another post. I started seeing a shadowy figure following me more and more. I dubbed him the Top Hat Man. He never did anything other than followed watch, yet he terrified me. I can still picture him in my head to this day, in the corner of my bedroom. But whenever I saw this spirit, Sarah was sure to follow, and he would leave as soon as she appeared. It got to its worst around 6th grade, and the last time I remember seeing both apparitions. I was doing homework in the dining room, and the Top Hat Man was watching me from across the living room. Sarah, acting almost as a guard dog, was sitting at the end of the couch, a barrier between me and the evil spirit. But this time, he did do something. He opened his eyes. Dark red eyes stared at me as he started to silently jolt to where I was. But Sarah stood up, put her hand up, and when they touched, poof, they were both gone. That was the end of it for me. But a few years later, I walked into my sister's room and she looked terrified. At the time I was 15 and she was 11. I eventually got the truth out of her, and she explained how she kept seeing a shadowy man in a top hat and a little girl called Sarah. For months she would come up to me in my room, the kitchen, even at my grandmother's once, crying, saying he was watching her. Around that time, we also got our house blessed due to demonic activity in the house, and she never brought it up again after that. I don't know if it happened to help or not, but I think we're both too scared to bring it up. I really wish that was the end, but among many friend groups in high school and middle school, at sleepovers, hangouts, and lunches, I've had opportunities to share ghost stories, as moody teens do. And my sister and I aren't the only ones with the same experience. A total of 10 other kids my age had the same exact thing happen to them. A tall shadow figure in a top hat, a blonde little girl named Sarah. Everyone saying the same thing. They stopped seeing them around 11 or 12 years old. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why. It's truly unexplainable. How are all these kids seeing the exact same thing? Why is it happening in my town? Does it happen elsewhere too? If someone, anyone has answers, please help.
My name is Johanna, and this is a story of the house that I grew up in. The house was built by my great-great-grandmother and has been in our family for generations. It was a beautiful 2-story home. It was full of charm and character, and my family lived there peacefully for so many years. We had our daily routines, shared our laughter and tears, and lived without much drama or excitement. Well, that was until my grandmother passed away. Grandma had been bedridden for a while, and she and Grandpa shared a room on the 2nd floor. After she passed, Grandpa decided to move downstairs. He said he needed a change and wanted to be closer to the rest of us. With this move, the 2nd floor became a place no one visited, and it didn't take long for it to show signs of neglect, peeling wallpaper, gathering dust, and just an overall sense of abandonment. At first, we didn't think much of it. Life just went on as usual. But soon, we started noticing odd things. Footsteps could be heard from the 2nd floor, as if someone was walking around. Our dogs would gather at the foot of the stairs, barking and growling at something none of us could see. I was just a young girl at that time, but I was convinced that the house was haunted. My mother, on the other hand, insisted that it had to be a wild animal that had somehow found its way inside. One day, after hearing the footsteps once more, my mom decided that it was time to take action. She grabbed a broom, determined to scare off whatever was causing the commotion. So I followed behind her, clinging to her pants as we approached the stairs. She told me to stay back, assured me that she'd just scare the animal away. And with a determined look, she threw the broom up the stairs, and it landed with a loud thud. We heard a rush scuttling noise, and then everything went silent. For a moment, Mom turned to me with a smirk, almost saying as if, "See? Nothing to worry about." But as we began to walk away, something happened that neither of us could explain. The broom came flying back down the stairs, crashing onto the ground with surprising force, as if someone had just thrown it back to us. I looked up, and I saw what vaguely resembled the shadow of a person, and it vanished as quickly as it appeared. I screamed, and my mom grabbed my hand, both of us rushing to find Grandpa. He was sitting in his favorite chair, and his presence brought a sense of calm. We told him what had happened, and he held us close, speaking in his gentle, soothing voice. Together, we decided that it was best to leave the second floor alone. We knew that ignoring the problem wouldn't solve anything, but as long as it stayed on the second floor, whatever it was, and we stayed on the first, we felt safe. Our neighbors, though, they occasionally brought up strange occurrences, figures in the windows, noises at odd hours, and we would nod and brush it off, not wanting to delve into the mystery of the second floor. Life continued, and we just adapted to living with the unknown presence there. Yet, the feeling that something was always watching lingered like a shadow over our lives. As I grew older, the haunting became a part of our family's history, a story whispered among us but never discussed openly. We accepted it as one of those things that couldn't be explained, or perhaps didn't want to be. In time, we moved out of the house, leaving behind both cherished memories and unsettling experiences. The house still stands to this day. We never really found out what haunted the second floor, and maybe that was for the best. Some mysteries are just meant to remain unsolved and tucked away in the past.
This is a story about when we renovated a used house and moved in with my family. My parents, my sister who was in the 3rd grade at the time, and myself who was in the 6th grade. We experienced a lot of strange phenomena, like in those scary stories, such as sleep paralysis, the sound of bare feet walking in the hallway, and red shadows on the glass of the door between the living room and the hallway. At the time, it felt so unreal that I enjoyed the strange phenomena moderately, saying things like, "Wow, a ghost." But then my sister, who was healthy, got sick, and my mother started taking more days off from her part-time job, so she was at home more often. My father and I were fine, so we asked a shrine to exorcise the house and put up talismans, but it didn't work. I also looked into rumors about the house at school and in the neighborhood, but there were no reported deaths or anything special about the house. At that time, someone who seemed to be an acquaintance of a colleague of my father's introduced us to a young man claiming to be a psychic. The guy, wearing a loose hoodie, seemed really excited. He took a quick look at us, walking around the house, and then just walked outside. "There's a red woman, and she's cursing women," he said. "A path has branched off from the main path, and she's coming in from there. I just put the path back on, so I think it's okay now." Then, he just drank some tea and left without asking for any payment, even though we were prepared to pay him. There was no exorcism, no ritual, no spell, and it was all very simple. That night, it felt like the whole house was rumbling, as if something was going to fall off the roof, with loud noises all night. It wasn't just a snap or a creak. It was like a loud bang, continuously. We all gathered in the living room and screamed, and I was so scared that I didn't know if it was a dream or reality. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear something trying to get into the house from the other side of the wall. When my father, half crying, called saying that the exorcism had failed, he was told, "They're putting up their final resistance. We'll take them all away before dawn comes." The sounds stopped abruptly at dawn. The next day, the spiritual phenomena had stopped, and my sister and mother gradually got better. I still can't forget how we all huddled together that night, shaking with fear.
Years ago, maybe 2010, my family and I were in a rental house in a gated community. Because we had just left our previous house and my family was growing from 4 to 6 members. Understandably, we needed a house more accommodating to our growing family. And we wouldn't have any pets for about 2 more years. So no cats, dogs or birds were living with us in the rental. While we were there in the rental home for about a year, there were some unexplained experiences in the house. Some are easy to explain, but there are a few that we just couldn't shrug off. Let me try describing the rental as best I can. It was a 1-level home, no basement or much of an attic, like most houses are in Arizona. The house was very large and the layout was simple. When you enter the house, to the left are the bedrooms. In front is a dining room and a sliding door out into a tiny backyard. And on the right is the living room and kitchen and such. There were about 5 bedrooms. The master bedroom where my parents slept in, a Jack and Jill room meaning 2 identical rooms connected by a bathroom, where myself and my brother Edwin used, and a single room where Jack and Nick slept together. They were between the ages of around 5 or 6 at the time. These 4 were connected by the hallway along the same wall, while the 5th was closer to the kitchen, and it was half the size of the other bedrooms, so my brothers and I used it to play video games in. There were also 3 bathrooms, but only 2 had a shower, the master bathroom and the Jack and Jill bathroom. The first thing my family and I noticed was hearing someone walking in the hallway. The hallway didn't have any carpet like the rest of the house, so it was loud enough to sort of echo. It may have been the air conditioner, but it sounded so much like someone was roaming the hallway. Countless times I would mistake the sound for my parents or brothers, but no one would be there when I looked, so it just felt more comforting to claim it was the air conditioning. A few weeks in, and after some unpacking, my mum started hearing a child's voice calling for her with, "Mum." But when she would ask my brothers and I, we would answer with, "Wasn't us." My brothers and I joked that maybe she was hearing things or going a little crazy from being home all day with the younger boys, or that it was the TV or iPad she was hearing. But sometimes it happened while no one else was home. It would just be her alone in the house. No TV nor iPad turned on. Another thing was the shower curtain in the Jack and Jill bathroom. The bar holding the curtains would always fall, even if nothing touched it. It didn't matter if anyone was in the bathroom or not. It would just rip itself from the wall. The curtain wasn't very heavy, even when wet, so it wasn't the weight causing it to fall. We thought maybe the bar was too small to reach across the walls, but perhaps the ends failed to stick to the wall and needed some kind of adhesive. But no matter what we did, it kept falling off. I recall vividly that I had just stepped out the shower and went towards my towel at the sink, which was to the opposite wall of the shower. Suddenly the bar hit me on the back. It was at least 2 feet from the shower, and it only hit me. I started using the shower in my parents' bathroom after that, but my brothers still used the Jack and Jill shower. I think they would take down the curtain before showering though, and the floor would always be soaked afterwards. During this time, my brother Jack would wake up at some point in the night to crawl into bed with my parents, It wasn't uncommon for my parents to wake up to Jack asking to crawl into bed with them in the middle of the night. My dad would be a little grouchy due to this, understandably, as Jack was almost 7 years old, and he didn't exactly lay still while sleeping. Jack tended to kick or swing his arms around, like he was clapping or punching as he slept. One night both my parents felt someone at the foot of the bed, like someone was sitting by their feet. Thinking it was Jack, my mum pulled the blanket down to let him under, but whoever it was at the foot of the bed didn't move. My mum looked to the end of the bed, thinking maybe Jack was scared to wake up Dad again. Yet, there was no one there, but there was still an impression in the bed. She woke up Dad and they both got out of bed to look for my little brother, even checking under the bed, but neither of my little brothers were anywhere in the master bedroom. My mum then looked into each of our bedrooms, finding all 4 of us in our own rooms still asleep. Neither Jack or Nick had left the bed that night. We moved out of the rental house later that year, but the activity didn't end just yet. Whatever it was seemed to follow us into the new house. Once again I had an experience in the shower. I was washing soap out of my eyes under the running water using both hands when I felt someone grip me by the hip. Shocked, I ignored the soap in my eyes to look, but no one was there. When I got out and looked in the mirror, I had a mark the shape and size of an adult's hand. I couldn't tell if it was a right or left hand, but it was definitely a hand. During some nights as I sit in bed, I would feel someone next to me. I would feel that presence touching me by my breast, but I would be wide awake and no one would be in the bed with me. Lights on and off, it didn't matter to whoever this invisible groper was. It was uncomfortable to be in my own room. Maybe it's because I'm a girl, but it seemed to really like being around me. This happened so often I would just shout, "Enough!" at whatever it was. And it did stop as soon as I gave the order, but it would happen again sometime later, or the next night. Just a few months after moving in, my brother Edwin was sick at home with pneumonia. He was allowed to be home rather than stay in the hospital, but he was borderline bedridden. His bedroom door was open maybe halfway when he saw someone walking in the hallway outside his door. Across from his room is mine, which Edwin claimed the figure walked out of. Edwin thought it was Jack, but when Edwin called out, no one answered. Minutes later, Mum came home with Jack, Nick and myself after picking us up from school. I believe it was 2013 or 14 when we had 2 dogs, Beagle Spaniel mix, so small dogs in the new house with us. They both didn't like strangers and would start barking at whoever they didn't know. One day I was in the living room alone with the dogs when they both started barking into the hallway, but when I checked there was no one in the hallway that I could see. Finally, the last experience I can remember was during a weekend or sometime during a school break. I was awake at around 1 a.m. in the living room on my laptop watching, ironically, an Australian ghost hunting show on YouTube. I had one earphone in when I heard shh in my left ear. I replayed the video a few seconds back but never heard the shh again, so it wasn't from the video. Feeling panicked, I turned off my laptop and for some reason said aloud, "I'm going to bed," rushing to my bedroom, feeling like someone was behind me the whole way. By the time I was in high school, about 3 years since the rental house, the activity died down. However, my history teacher told the class about the discovery of a mummified man who was found by local hunters. I'm not sure how long the body was out in the desert, if the body was identified or claimed, or if it was connected to the strange activity in any way. My thought was maybe whoever this man was once lived in the house, or if his body was near where I live now. But I thought I would mention it just in case. Nowadays we haven't had any unnatural experiences, so I believe whatever it was returned to the rental house, or it left because my family and I became born-again Christians and didn't want to be around us anymore. The only thing nowadays has been a tapping or knocking outside my bedroom window on a random night, which I still haven't been able to solve. Hopefully I can record the noise when it happens again, but I can't guarantee, as it happens on random nights, usually around 1 or 2 a.m.
My friends wanted to break into this haunted house at the edge of town. It's been abandoned for years. Rumor has it, some woman lost her life in there once, and now she haunts the place. People say even just walking through the door is a death sentence. I didn't want to go. My friends laughed and laughed. I can't believe you're such a scaredy cat. So we went. They shrieked at every bump and creak as we walked up the stairs. They pointed and whispered about every shadow in the dark rooms. They claimed that the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls were actually ghostly whispers. As we left, my friends laughed at me. "Were you scared? It wasn't that bad," they said. I didn't say anything. Instead, I went back home. I nudged the door open a crack, and I peered inside my own dark foyer. I took a deep breath and walked inside. Instantly, a plate whizzed past my face. I ducked to the side, but it caught me against the side of my head and shattered. I felt blood dripping down to my neck as I crept into the kitchen. The floor was covered in shattered flatware and bloody footprints. I could hear whispers bubbling up from the drain, speaking my name over and over. A deep thumping sounded from beneath the floorboards. "I'm sorry I was gone so long," I said. "I won't do it again." The thumping stilled. The whispering paused. I didn't wait for an answer, knowing that there would not be one. I crept up to my bedroom instead, where the shadow woman always stands in the corner. I hate when she's there, but it's worse, far worse, when she's not. "Were you scared?" my friends had asked. No, I wasn't, because I know what a real haunted house looks like.
When I was 3, my family moved to Carmel, California. Our mother was casting astrological charts on the side for extra money. She became very good friends with a high Wiccan priestess, who was astonished at how accurate her readings were. So she tried everything to get Mum to join. It kind of intrigued Mum, but she graciously declined because she was on a different path. This high priestess had so much admiration and faith in my mother that she gave her a very old book of spells, a grimoire. Mum said that you couldn't just go out and buy this book. It was only in the archives in England, and an endorsement was required to receive it. The front of this book had white spells and positive incantations, but the back of the book had dark spells, summoning dark forces to do your bidding. She also gave her an actual cat's eye ring and a bat's heart that my sister Charity wore on a chain around her neck. Weird. Mum later moved us to Pacific Grove. She found a house through a friend of a friend, and it was a deal she just could not refuse. It was a 3-level house with an attic, and the price was perfect. Nothing down, just start paying the mortgage, and the house was hers. Mum was so excited. This was the first house that she had ever owned, so she didn't even question why it was so cheap or why such a great deal. She just marked it off as being a blessing. It was a tall split-level house with a bedroom for Mum on the bottom floor, with the kitchen and living room. And above that were 2 bedrooms, one for my brother, and the other one was for my eldest sister Linda, my sister Melanie and myself. And then there was the attic where my other 2 sisters, Charity and Rachel, stayed. I have no memory of these events, so after separately interviewing 3 of my siblings and what I was told by my mother and eldest sister before they passed, this is what they recalled. Things were all right for the first few weeks, but then everyone in the house started experiencing signs of a poltergeist. Things being thrown and terrifying visits in their bedrooms. My brother had the bedroom with the door to the attic in it. He said that he didn't even know why, but the attic was always 60 degrees, even that hot summer. He said that one night the family cat was sleeping on his bed, and he was about to fall asleep when the cat jumped up and arched its back and hissed. He looked in the direction the cat was looking, and down the steps from the top was a dark floating blob. He said that he ran downstairs and it followed him. Our mother loved hanging pictures on staircases and in halls, and he said that this thing moved swiftly down the staircase, so much so the pictures flew off the walls and crashed to the floor. He then ran downstairs to our mother's room, where I was sleeping with her, and woke her up. She told him to see himself in white light and to say the universal word for God, which is Om. He said that he laid on the floor next to Mum's bed and didn't sleep a wink that night. He told me that he was sitting in the living room and a cat figurine jumped off the mantel and hit him hard in the head, and things were being tossed all the time. Everyone thought that there was something off with our sister Charity, who stayed in the attic with Rachel. Charity started isolating herself from everyone and wanted to be alone with her many mice. She would leave the house and talk to the trees, and she felt like the leaves were answering her. When walking to school, she never wanted to make that long walk on the country road with her siblings, but more preferred to walk alone. She told me that a lot of the time in the house, it was as if her memories were shrouded by fog, like she was there but wasn't at the same time. Charity said that she wished I hadn't asked her because she had forgotten things about that house. She said that it might have been possible at times that something was near her, wanting her to be alone. She was only 12. Our mother sold wigs at the time. It went quite well into the 60s. She would hold wig parties at the house, and this was the time Charity would feel the closest to our mother. Charity would style the wigs for her, and when they were sold, she was so proud. It was their thing together. Well, at one of these parties, Charity was upstairs in the attic with her mice. She took very good care of them. She took one out and set him on the table, and she turned around to get something out of the cage, when, only a moment later, she heard screams coming from the living room 2 flights down. She said that Mum was mad and screaming for her to come down, and when she did, there was her mouse, the one that was upstairs. She knew there wasn't enough time for him to get down 2 flights. He was right in front of her. Later, she had one of her mice and her babies in a secure, locked cage, with no possible way in or out. And a wild mouse got in and killed the baby mice and the mother. She loved them so much. She knew it was whatever was in the house doing this. She said that she too saw pictures fly off the walls, one even smashing on her head. She wanted to make it go away, so she said that she got our mother's book, the one with the spells. But after trying to find something that would rid us of this thing, she said that it was too confusing, so she put it back. Charity said that she was getting more irritated with the family and sharing a room with Rachel, and she wanted to have space of her own, so she went downstairs to the unfinished part of the basement and put her bed between the walls with her mice. She told me that she didn't last too long down there because she saw things that frightened her. She went on to describe that they were shadows, light-colored shadows, taunting her, so she ran upstairs and slept on a couch. All of these events, plus some of her own, got our mother to get a priest to come and exorcise the house. He was in there for a while as my family stayed outside, but when he came out, he looked pale and told our mother to move immediately. He said that it's not going to leave and that she should sell the house. I stayed outside with my sister, but when they went into the house to grab our things, they said that it was right out of a movie. Things were broken and tossed, and as we were going down the hall, pictures were flying off the wall at us. We took only our clothes and went to a motel. We soon moved into an apartment and sent for our things. My mother found out that originally the house belonged to a church and 2 priests lived and had their offices there. But they were both found dead in the attic with their throats slashed There were demonic drawings on the walls in the priest's blood, and the killings were blamed on a cult. Mum said that the place was sold 5 times in 2 years before we got it. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. Well, happy Halloween everyone. I want to say a huge thank you to all my fellow narrators who joined me on this one. I'm so lucky to have so many talented friends. And of course, a thank you to all of the story authors for giving me permission to use their stories. If you have a story to share, please send it to my email in the description below. This channel is mostly made up of stories sent in by viewers or people they know. Another way to support the channel is to sign up for my Patreon, where you can watch my videos ad-free. Also, I'll be adding new designs to the merch store, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for your continuous support. And remember,
Papa loves you.